right into conduct of business. 10A is receive a report and provide comments on the city's proposed 2014-2022 general plan housing element update, accept the 2013 Housing Element Annual Progress Report, APR, and direct staff to forward the report to the California State Office of Planning and Research and the California Department of Housing and Community Development. Mark?
Thank you. Good evening. Is this on? Good evening, Honorable Mayor, City Council members. This item is a report on the housing element, the City of San Bruno's housing element. There are actually two actions that the City Council will take on this item. The first is to adopt a resolution accepting the 2013 Annual Progress Report for the current housing element. And as I mentioned, this is just covers the year 2013. It's due annually to the Department of Housing and Community Development. And the second action is to receive a report on the update of the housing element for the 2014-2022 planning period. That's the current housing element is considered the fourth cycle, and the next one is the fifth cycle, just so that
Mark, can you get a little closer to the microphone so everyone can hear?
Yeah,
there
it is.
You go. There
Indeed.
You go.
Okay. So just as a bit of background, the housing element is required by state law. It is an element of the general plan, and it's the only element of the general plan that's required to be approved by the state, by the Department of Housing and Community Development, and to be reviewed annually by the state. And it provides a tool to promote housing production to meet the housing needs of people of all incomes and all needs within the community. And there are essentially 5 mandated sections of the housing element. There's a housing needs assessment, which essentially looks at current and projected demographics, housing conditions, and what the needs are of special groups such as female-headed households, extremely low-income households, people with disabilities. Another section is the housing constraints and resources. What are the constraints, governmental and in the private sector, that prevent housing from being developed or hinder it from being developed? Then there's a land inventory and quantified objectives, which basically is designed to meet the regional housing needs, which is determined from the state all the way down to the local level. And the city has to identify sites to meet its housing needs. Then there's also goals and programs and implementation actions, which are designed to facilitate housing for various needs groups and to achieve our regional housing needs allocation. And then finally, there's an assessment of how the previous housing element succeeded in implementing the actions for that housing element. So in terms of the progress in the last year, the regional housing needs allocation for San Bruno, or RHNA as we like to call it, was a total of 973 units. And as you can see, it's broken out by different income levels, very low, low, moderate, and above moderate. We had sufficient sites identified that are zoned for residential, which is the requirement under RHNA. But we also actually produced a fair amount of the housing. A total of 750 units have been completed or are under construction between 2007 and the end of last year. So that is significant progress. Looking now at the accomplishments of the whole housing element period from 2007 to 2014, the city had a number of accomplishments, including, as I mentioned, 750 units completed. The below market rate housing ordinance was adopted, and we've also collected about approximately $3.5 million in affordable housing in lieu fees, which can be used to assist affordable housing within the city. The residential guidelines were adopted. Emergency shelter zoning and area for that was identified by the City Council. The Transit Corridors Plan was adopted. The zone code update was started and is moving along. There's been substantial progress in that. And the city has continued to provide financial assistance to local housing organizations. And to see some of the projects that were completed, there's the parcels 3 and 4 at the crossing, which is 350 units. Those are the last 2 housing sites at the crossing development. Pacific Bay Vistas, the major remodel, essentially redevelopment of the old Treetops development, that's 308 units. The Crestmore rebuilding, that's gone along quite well. There are 17 homes that are completed or under construction. Merrimont in 2009, 70 single-family homes. Cedar Mills, 14 single-family homes completed in 2012. And Skycrest, which actually was stalled because of the economic downturn in 2008 and was revived a year ago, and the last 12 homes are going to be completed this year. So what else needs to be done for the current housing element? In order to be in compliance with state housing law, the city needs to implement 4 programs that are identified in the current housing element. And these all involve zone code amendments. And those 4 changes are zoning for transitional and supportive housing. And essentially, it's defining transitional and supportive housing as a residential use with allowed as any other residential use. And so that's a fairly simple change. Adopt reasonable accommodation policies and procedures, and that's essentially reasonable accommodation for people with disabilities so that there could be modifications to zoning standards to allow, for example, a ramp within a front yard setback or a wall or something like that, so that a disabled person could enjoy their property. Adopt a density bonus ordinance, and that's a bit more complicated, but the density bonus law requires that we do that. It's up to 35% increase in density for projects that provide affordable housing on a sliding scale. And it also allows concessions to zoning. So, for example, depending on the amount of affordable housing provided, the city would be required to grant zoning concessions such as reduced setbacks or reduce landscape requirements or something like that in order to make the project possible. And finally, zoning for emergency shelters. The City Council discussed this back in 2010 and identified the transit-oriented, the TOD land use classification in the 2009 general plan as an appropriate location for emergency shelter zoning. And staff is working on these zone code amendments. They're about complete, and we expect to bring them forward in May. So we'll be seeing those fairly soon. Now going to the housing element update for the 2014-2022 period. We're working with 21 Elements, which is a county-wide sort of consortium of all 21 jurisdictions in the county, working together to do all the things that are sort of in common and, efficient use of resources so that we can, get things done that are common to all the communities while also customizing the housing elements for each jurisdiction. We're also, the entire 21 Elements is working towards what's called a streamlined review by HCD and the Housing and Community Development Department. And this would allow an expedited review of the housing element, which is important because the housing element has to be adopted by January 31st, 2015. And if it is not adopted by then, Well, if it is adopted by then, we enter into an 8-year cycle for the next housing element, so that we would be good for 8 years. If it doesn't get adopted on time by the deadline, it's reduced to 4 years. You would have to do this process again in 4 years. So streamlined review is really important. And our new regional housing needs allocation number for this 8-year period is 1,155 units. So those are the number of units that we need to provide zoning for, not build, but provide zoning for the next 8 years. And just for the public here and at home, we have we'll have the draft chapters of the housing element and other information about the housing element on the city's website. And this is sort of the direct URL, but you can just go to the city website and the planning, and you'll find the link to the housing element. The housing element starts with housing needs, and just to give you a little bit of a context and background, ABAG has done projections through 2040, and they basically project that in the Bay Area there will be a growth of about 1.1 million new jobs throughout the Bay Area. This translates into a need for new housing of 660,000 housing units. And just sort of extrapolating on what the needs are by income level, the estimate is that roughly 56% of those housing units need to be affordable to low and very low income households. So you can see the need is enormous. I mean, it's really huge. And in San Bruno, currently, about 60% of households earning below $75,000 overpay for housing, which under sort of federal definitions mean that people pay more than 30% of their income for housing. And on top of all that, there's been a tremendous loss of funding for affordable housing. Federal funds have declined year by year. State housing subsidies have gone away, including redevelopment. And there were a couple of bond measures that provided funding for housing, and they're about dried up now. So there are huge challenges in the future in this next cycle. So here is our RHNA allocation for the next housing cycle period. And as you can see, the total 1,155 units, how it's broken down, is roughly 180 units, or 180 units for extremely low and very low income households, 161 for low, 205 for moderate, and 431 for above moderate. So basically what that's showing is that about 44% of the housing produced in the next cycle should be affordable to people at lower incomes. And that's another enormous challenge. So the housing element update process we've started now. We've started draft chapters. We have a draft housing needs chapter. We're working on updating the goals and programs section, and also identifying sites for housing. There's a lot of carryover from the last element, but there will need to be zone code changes in order to accommodate the full 1,155 units. And our goal or our target is to adopt the housing element, to have the City Council adopt the housing element in October. And that will give time for HCD review and certification by January. And just to let you know, there's a 120-day grace period. So things don't happen. January 31st is not a drop-dead date, although we're treating it as if it is. So the next steps are really, first is to complete the current cycle housing element implementation actions, and that's those 4 zone code amendments that I mentioned. And then continue preparation of the 5th cycle housing element update, I mentioned a couple of these things already, identifying adequate housing sites and updating programs, public input and participation, and the public has an opportunity tonight to comment or ask questions about the housing element. And we will have an open house and once we get the draft completed. And we expect to complete the draft housing element in June, and we'll bring it back to the City Council for review prior to submitting it for an initial review by HCD. And that concludes my presentation.
Question mark. I know the numbers 1,155 aren't going to change, but do the underlying monetary values change over the 8-year period? The underlying monetary qualifications for moderate and low and
yes,
extremely low.
they change on an annual basis, and they're set by Department of Housing and Urban Development, by HUD. So every year they're adjusted.
Okay, and they're adjusted on a regional basis?
They are adjusted county by county.
County by county.
So yeah, this is for San Mateo County. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
To the chair. Mark, I realize you'd really want a lot of public input on this, but I doubt if you're going to get it. But for the public that's listening or would consider comments on the housing element, what sort of things should they be concerned about? I mean, you're talking about zoning here, or rezoning.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think, for example, with the emergency shelter zoning, we will need to do a notification for that around the area. So I would imagine we'll get some public input on that when we do the notification. But other things are sort of what are the priorities? What are the community's priorities? What do people see the needs are? I mean, is it senior housing? Is it senior housing, multifamily senior housing near the train station? Transitional housing, what are the types of housing that people really see the biggest needs are? I mean, is it workforce housing for families? Is it, larger household with more bedrooms for families, or smaller? Smaller units for single working people. I mean, I guess those are the types of things I think we'd be looking for.
Okay. Anything else? Need any action by us tonight, Mark?
There is a resolution related to the annual progress report, for accepting the annual progress report.
Is there a resolution this evening, or just a motion to?
Yes, there is.
Yeah.
Where did I see that? Oh, okay. All right. Would someone like to
No
introduce that
other
resolution?
comments. I'll introduce the resolution. Accepting the progress report.
Councilmember Ibarra.
Aye.
Councilmember Salazar.
Aye.
Councilmember O'Connell.
Aye.
Vice Mayor Medina.
Aye.
Mayor Ruane.
Aye.